In this video on how to write a symphony, I'm going to take an interesting approach, and we're going to look at the symphony as a piece of drama, in that it's a play, a story that needs to unfold. And your job as the composer is to best present that story and that element of drama. For this, I'm going to reach back to my years teaching English, which turns out to be one of the most important things I've done as far as a composer, is to be able to teach something that is a creative aspect but completely unrelated to music and music composition. As such, I'm going to go and look at the elements of storytelling, and particularly we're going to be looking at plot, because that's the most relevant thing that we have to music composition. So what is plot? Plot is the overall story, the action that takes place. In the plot, we have to have some varying things. You're going to have your introduction. A symphony, any piece of music will have an introduction, no matter what it is. It's the first thing you hear. It's the introduction. Now, some of the differences here is the introduction can vary between a musical piece and a literary or dramatic piece. But that's up to the composer and the author. And the length of the introduction can vary. In a piece of literature or a drama, the introduction typically will be can be longer than it will be in the symphony. The symphony, you want to get the introduction out of the way pretty quickly. The next aspect is the rising action. This is perhaps the most important aspect of both a work of drama, a work of literature, and a work of music. In the rising action, all the story takes place. This is where you develop your conflict, you develop your musical ideas. This is the development. If you want to make a piece longer, more dramatic, build up the rising action. In a good work of literature, this can take 75% of the work, if not more. To deal with this in music, one of the best things to work with is contrasts. And go big, go small, but stuff in the middle is boring. Go here, and if you are working in more extremes, you're going to develop more of that conflict. You're going to develop more of your rising action, and you're going to give the music a place to go, because it has to go somewhere. You have to have that end goal in mind. If there is no end goal, you haven't crafted a fulfilling piece of music, and you haven't crafted a fulfilling piece of literature or drama. And that end goal, of course, is called the climax. The climax is the big finale point. This is the final battle in our hero's tale. This is the grand finale of our symphony. It's that point that we're reaching towards. Perhaps one of my favorite climaxes is the end of Mahler's 8th Symphony. Mahler's 8th Symphony is just this massive work. It is 75 minutes long, and it's got two climaxes in it. One at the end of the first movement and one at the end of the second movement. And there are only two movements. And the one at the end of the first movement comes just right at the end, but the one at the end of the second movement is just this glorious build-up. You start off at the quietest moment in the whole symphony with the chorus singing as softly as they can go. And then from there, they build and build and build and build. And finally, there's a single quarter note, one quarter note, the only quarter note in the entire piece of music when the entire ensemble plays together. The only tutti in 75 minutes of music, and that single quarter note is the climax. And then from the climax you have your falling action and resolution. In literature, this can be spread out over a little bit. In music, it needs to happen pretty quickly, because once you've reached that climax, you don't need to say anything else. You've said everything, you've reached your goal, you're done. In literature, you need to wrap up some loose ends. Music, the loose ends should be wrapped up by the end. Another aspect of the storytelling I will draw from Joseph Campbell's Hero with 1,000 Faces. This book right here and the ideas that are contained within should help you develop ideas of your symphony being a character. The character has to go through an arc. And there's a general formula for this, and I'll put on screen right now what is a diagram for what Campbell called the monomyth. In the monomyth, the hero starts out at the top, they're normal, then they go through this whole series of adventures and conquest to return back to where they started, but maybe a little changed. If you understand the concepts that Campbell lays out, and I'm not going to go into them in this video because it's something that could take an entire course to understand and learn, but if you understand that, you understand the arc that the character needs to go through. That arc can be translated into musical ideas and musical form. That know that your character has to go through these trials and tribulations, so too does your music. You've got to go and you've got to have your battles, you've got to have your dark places, you've got to have your light places, and you've got to have your victory at the end. And maybe that victory at the end is bittersweet. It's not going to be triumphant. Maybe it's going to be melancholy. But maybe it is triumphant too. It depends on the story you want to tell. If you're thinking of your symphony in terms of a story, in structure, you're going to have a more satisfying piece of music. Now, this is not to say that your symphony has to be programmatic. This has nothing to do with programmatic versus absolute music. This is just overall storytelling structure. If your symphony has a cohesive flow, building on that idea of plot line, building on the idea of a hero's tale, then you will have a convincing piece of music that audiences will be able to latch onto. And that's one of the things that a lot of people forget, is that your job as a composer is to have audiences latch on to your music. If they don't latch on, your music in some regards has failed because you haven't conveyed your message properly. Or you haven't conveyed your message in a way that makes it understandable to the audience. That's something to really keep in mind, is the audience is who you are writing for. Think about the audience in terms of general aspects. The more esoteric, the more heady you make it, the harder it is to understand. And that's not to say that the most cerebral and academic music out there is bad, but it becomes more difficult for the audience to understand. And maybe it's one of those that with exposure in time, they will be able to understand it. But it could also be that you've gone over their heads and you've done something that's too difficult. So some things to keep in mind from this lesson. Think about the structure of your symphony like that of a work of drama, work of literature. Think about the plot line. Start with your introduction, your rising action going up to your climax, and then maybe a short resolution. Also think about it in terms of a hero's tale, a big circle going through all the trials and tribulations that a hero must go through. If you think of these aspects, your music will automatically take on a more human-like quality, which is one of the things that we composers should strive for. We're creating music for humans. We're not creating music for machines, for computers, for anything else. We're creating music for humans to understand and connect to, not just the audience, but also the performers too. Keep these in mind as you're writing your symphony. And next time, we'll look at melodies and motives.